is the effective remainder of a fully representative circulation. 3. In all cases, the CMF shall retire principal or payment of principal from circulation. Thus, by virtue of a perpetual resultant equivalence between remaining obligation, remaining value of related property, and remaining circulation, ever effectively including monetizable equity, it shall in turn ensure an immutable inflation, deflation, and maldisposition-free circulation, even without regulation. So we've shown our infamous legislators and presidents and financial ministers and all in glorious terms how to do this even virtually without cost. D. Necessary provision of ideal infrastructures for integration of modern automation processes. The CMF shall provide ideal infrastructures for integration of modern commercial and automation processes. In other words, we're going to take this power away from the banks, and if you want to process credit cards in your business, it's a virtually costless process which has to be streamlined. It's an obligation of the CMF to do this at likewise minimal or negligible cost, and imposing minimal efforts on the part of all concerned. E. Mandatory minimization of costs. The CMF shall deliver every object of its purposes at minimal cost and without taking profit, justly distributing costs according to willful consumption, so as its distribution of costs is comprehensive, even of dormant account activity. You don't do anything, you're not charged for it. F. Criminality of respective breaches of authority. Any attempt to encumber rightful implementation of this proof of singular integral sustaining principles shall be treason. Section 7.4. Legal means, extents, and burdens of taxation respective to monetization of common governmental activities and infrastructures. We're prescribing how taxation has to be executed for eternity afterward. We're prescribing the only rules by which just taxation exists in every possible case here. The sole purpose and authority of taxation shall be to impose no more and no less than minimal, commensurable payment upon willful, voluntary consumers of actual and necessary assets, services, or infrastructures provided by existing, explicit, and conformant consent of the people. Now, taxation can exist even without our consent. Every bill for raising funding for a project has to prescribe how it will be paid for by those who consume of it, or it can't even be passed by the people. A. Section 7.4a, in other words. Consensual monetization and payment of government costs. Properties associated with the former convention of spending measures shall be monetized strictly by the principles of mathematically perfected economy in the duties of the common monetary foundry, and the commensurable costs of willful consumption shall be paid by consumers, likewise retiring principal at the rate of consumption or depreciation over the proprietary determinate lifespan of the related property. And I might mention then, in regard to this purported alternate of spending money into circulation, which my 1975 parable of perfect economy introduced only to invalidate it in public presentations on the matter, that this is a necessity of just taxation, that whatever is spent into circulation is paid for likewise by those who consume of it. So this capability and incumbent responsibility to do so eliminates the kind of taxation that has to be proposed in spending money into circulation, because you're spending it for essentially redundant infrastructures or potentially redundant infrastructures merely because you need money into circulation to represent something else, and then forcing the people to earn it before they can acquire it or produce it. Whereas issuance of promissory obligations allows the same person to do so immediately. So there's a huge difference between the conflicting propositions. A. Consensual monetization and payment of government costs. Properties associated with the former convention of spending measures shall be monetized strictly by the principles of mathematically perfected economy in the common monetary foundry, and the commensurable costs of willful consumption shall be paid by consumers, likewise retiring principal at the rate of consumption or depreciation over the proprietary determinate lifespan of the related property. So we're going to show how to tax ourselves for roads, for instance, by imposing the tax on something that we consume, which is commensurable or parallel, in other words, with our consumption or usage of roads. If we walk and we don't use fuel, which we could tax to pay for roads, then we're not paying for the roads, which we're not consuming, and which is a just means of levying taxation, in other words. 1. Legal scope of taxation, or legal distribution of the burdens of taxation. Taxation shall exist only to fulfill resultant obligations to pay for consumption, and shall be levied proportionate and solely for consensual consumption, by means which shall, to the greatest practical extent, fully automate compliant payment and fair distribution of costs, except A. Whereas in the case of publicly administered insurances, in which commensurable costs are determined to be shared, however otherwise, therefore, quote, proportionate to and solely for consensual consumption, unquote, shall be understood to mean a most just, intended, and assented manner of distributing minimized costs. There's just this one exception where we might decide, for the sake of insurance, to share the costs. Hurricane might blow through this entire hurricane region. So we agree, those who live in the hurricane region, to share the costs. It might hit us, it might hit somebody in the next county or next state, whatever. So we determined to share the costs, and they're distributed according to these principles, which of course eliminates, for instance, contemporary insurance companies from purportedly investing in securities and taking further profit from us, which may or may not be applied to reducing the cost of insurance, which costs, of course, we would be paying on the other end of that activity. Nonetheless, so there isn't any possible benefit to us, and so we're eliminating all this incommensurable behavior, which only comprises opportunities for further exploitation and disservice. 2. Obligation to minimize costs. Of course, anything economic is always an obligation to minimize costs. So we're saying this again. Absolute minimization of costs shall be obligated in all spending and taxation measures. So of course we can prosecute any deviation from this principle, which shall provide for breach of this duty to be fully refunded, together with potential punitive damages to payers from all parties receiving proceeds of undue costs. Set up your contractor buddy to provide something on an uncontested or uncompeted bid to exploit the people, and you and he will be paying the proceeds back to the people. B. Obligation to streamline interaction. Methods of taxation shall, across their entire breadth and perpetually to the greatest extent ever practical, eliminate or streamline all dutiful interaction of consumers in the means of payment, of taxation, in other words. The general principle of this obligation shall be to associate the means of taxation with consumption of vital related properties, that a uniform rate of tax on related property shall distribute costs proportionate to consumption. So we don't even have to think about it. We pull up to the gas pump, and the actual taxes, which have to be minimal, relate to how much we're consuming roads. In concurrence with this requisite pattern, no taxation of assets can be removed directly from any account maintained in the CMF, but by explicit, complete, issue-by-issue assent of the account holders. So in the case of pulling up to a gas pump, your consent is explicit that you're going to burn this gas to, consume proportionally of the roads, and you've agreed to this method of taxation because it had to be agreed by the people. 2. Every practical minimization of the costs and duties of collection imposed shall be imperative. Effective compliance in every aspect of resultant implementations of collection shall perpetually be subject to public scrutiny, assent, obligatory refinement, and commensurable punitive measures without impediment in the fulfillment of each. So anybody abuses these processes, and they're subject to the severe penalties of this act. C. Unlawful exercise of taxation as a regulatory device. We're outlining the carbon tax here, or anything like it. In other words, it's no alternative of government to purportedly discourage, say, unwanted or undesirable activities of any nature by taxation. Instead, they have to limit or outlaw the activity, whichever is the case. So C is unlawful exercise of taxation as a regulatory device. No taxation whatever shall be exercised as a regulatory device, or shall be levied against property, production, inheritance, gift, or income, and all claims of obligation to pay such taxations, however delinquent or otherwise ostensibly extended, are hereby rendered null and void. You're behind on your taxes. We're forgiving you. You shouldn't be paying them at all, because so much of it is going for interest upon interest upon interest upon interest. We should all be resisting taxation, but we are forgiving everyone who's delinquent, behind, and we're relieving them of any ostensible obligation which derives from the present unjust taxations which have been imposed upon us. D. Obligatory seizure of all prosecutions of the people for non-compliance with former unlawful exercise of taxation or inherent prior breach of authority. All ostensible crimes against such ostensibly existent or bearing laws, therefore, however purportedly outstanding, are hereby forgiven and resolved. E. Criminal prosecution for breach of power. Any breach of the principle of consent or imposition of redundant or unreasonable expense is non-enforceable, and every attempt to enforce any of the aforesaid breaches of extent or principle on any party to this mandate from the moment of their signature shall be severe criminal transgression of this act. In other words, taxman comes to your door, you show him that you've signed this mandate, and you show him this provision of the mandate. He wants to prosecute you. You take his name down, you record the event. He's guilty of treason. Section 7.5. Seizure of further crimes and related government attempts, purportedly to privatize public infrastructures. A. Unlawful dissolution of infrastructures belonging to the people and rightfully managed only to the discretion of the people. This is a very serious issue where, owing to unjustifiable multiplication of falsified indebtedness by interest. The costs of